Welcome to tonight's chilling journey into the unknown. I sincerely hope that after hearing these tales you will be able to sleep soundly, but be warned, sleep paralysis, often referred to as the dead riding you, is more than just a figment of your imagination. It's our brain unlocking a different level of consciousness, exposing us to entities we cannot normally perceive. What's more terrifying is that sometimes this state of mind acts as a doorway, allowing those entities to cross into our world or magnify our perception. Have you ever felt a presence lingering even after you've woken from a nightmare? You're not alone. These horrific figures from our dreams sometimes remain with us in reality, leaving us to question the boundaries between the two worlds. I urge you to listen closely, not just to these stories, but to any sounds you hear in your room tonight. My name is Carlos Garcia, speaking to you from New York City. Welcome to Grim Secrets. Tonight I will tell 3 stories that will lead you to reflect on your nights of sleep. Let me share an experience that has haunted me for months. It all started during a particularly difficult period in my life. I had distanced myself from my family and friends, and the overwhelming stress at work was pushing me to the brink of collapse. One night, while struggling to sleep, I experienced something terrifying: sleep paralysis. I couldn't move, and it felt like an invisible force was pinning me to the bed. My heart pounded furiously, and this terrifying experience began to happen weekly, escalating as my stress levels increased. Eventually, I started to experience hallucinations. The first time, I was jolted awake by a voice saying, "Hello." Startled, I opened my eyes, believing it was part of my dream. But then I heard it again, and I swear I was fully awake. The voice was coming from beside my wardrobe. It was eerie, and I couldn't determine if it was a man's, woman's, or child's voice. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Then, an oppressive weight fell all over my body, and I was gripped by an overwhelming fear, as if something was trying to drag me from my bed. The next morning I convinced myself it was just a nightmare, but the sleep paralysis became more frequent. I began to see shadows. One in particular, a massive figure over 2 meters tall, stood by my bed. Even though it had no face, I knew it was watching me. This shadow was so dark that it stood out even in the pitch black of my room. But the most terrifying experience was the night I was awakened by the sound of a woman crying. I couldn't move, but I could feel the weight of someone sitting at the foot of my bed. When I opened my eyes, I saw a woman with long, disheveled hair crouched at my feet, her face buried in her knees, softly muttering, "No, no, no." But she wasn't alone. At the far end of my room by my wardrobe, I saw another woman, her silhouette barely visible in the dark. Her eyes gleamed like a cat's, and she stared at me intensely, muttering words I couldn't understand. I tried to pray, but I couldn't finish the Lord's Prayer. When I finally regained control of my body, I jumped up, turned on all the lights, and washed my face, leaving every light in the house on for the rest of the night. Sleep was out of the question. I researched sleep paralysis and learned that it often causes auditory and visual hallucinations, which reassured me somewhat. But then strange things began to happen even when I was awake. Things I couldn't explain. I started hearing barefoot footsteps like those of a child running through my house, accompanied by the sound of a child's laughter. And that shadow, oh, that shadow, began appearing during the day, first at home, then at work. What convinced me that this was all real was when my aunt, who was visiting, mentioned to my mother that she had clearly heard a child running barefoot in the room upstairs. My mother, who had also heard the footsteps, initially thought it was the neighbor's child. But when she began hearing them in the hallway at night, she realized something was very wrong. One night my mother came into my room, waking me up to ask if I was okay. She told me she had been woken by the sound of crying, and when she went to check, she heard the crying coming from my room. But as soon as she opened the door, the crying stopped. Her words scared me so much that I ended up sleeping in her bed that night. The next day at work, a colleague asked if I was okay, saying I looked very tired. I couldn't take it anymore and confided in her about what was happening. I thought she wouldn't believe me, but she explained that sometimes stress attracts negative entities. She suggested I go to therapy, socialize more, and find ways to distract myself. I followed her advice, and slowly, the manifestations began to decrease. However, I still catch glimpses of that 2-meter-tall shadow out of the corner of my eye, especially when I'm stressed. And we still occasionally hear the sound of a child walking barefoot around the house. The crying has stopped, and I pray it never returns because that terrified me the most. I haven't seen the woman hiding behind my wardrobe again, but I haven't completely lost my fear of these experiences. It's a lie that you get used to seeing things. Sometimes I wonder if they will ever disappear completely or if they will always be there. But thank you for listening, community. I hope that by sharing this with you, I can find some peace and perhaps better understand what I've been going through. In the next story, I will talk about a childhood encounter with darkness. Good evening, Carlos and the Grim Secrets community. My name is Danny, and I'm from Baja, California. Although I won't say exactly where, as one of my sisters also listens to Grim Secrets, I felt compelled to share a story that has stayed with me since childhood. My family has been Christian since I was 5, and we've always attended church regularly. When I was 11, my parents became pastors, and my father also became the leader of the worship team. My siblings and I spent most of our time at the church helping out wherever we were needed, so naturally I ended up serving in the worship team as well. It was exhausting work, especially when there were evangelistic events, which often required us to attend services 2 or 3 days in a row. At these events, you would see all sorts of things. People speaking in tongues, deliverances, people crying, shouting, laughing. It was a lot to take in, but over time you get used to it. But one day, something happened that I will never forget. During one of these events, we were playing music for the worship, and I noticed a man and his wife sitting in the front row. The wife was very tall, beautiful, but with a face that seemed to carry a lot of anger. I remember them because they were sitting right in front of the pulpit. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to come forward for prayer, the husband stood up and approached him. They spoke quietly for a moment before the pastor called his wife, the pastor's wife, over. They exchanged words, and then the pastor's wife began to pray for the woman. As soon as she started praying, the woman let out a loud scream and fell to the floor, writhing like a snake, shouting for the pastor's wife to be silent. My mother rushed over to help, and together they tried to continue praying for her. It was impossible not to notice her because her movements were so unnatural. The pastor also came over to pray, and it seemed like they were making progress because the woman stopped screaming. But then she lifted her head, and I'll never forget what I saw. Her pupils were so dilated that her eyes looked completely black, as if they were entirely consumed by darkness. She lifted her gaze as if searching for something or someone. My father, who was leading the worship, told us not to look into her eyes, to close ours and sing with faith. I tried to do as he said, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened my eyes just a little and saw the woman being carried into a small room by her husband, my mother, and the pastor's wife. They stayed in that room until the service was over. Later that night, we arrived home around 11 p.m., completely exhausted. I was woken up around 2 or 3 a.m. by a lot of noise in the hallway outside my room. My older sister was crying, and when I asked what was wrong, she told me not to come out, that our mother was very sick but that I should stay in the room. My sister is 2 years older than me, very mature and deeply involved in the church. She has always had a gift, or as we call it in the Christian community, a gift of discernment. She can sense spirits or demons attached to people, places, or objects. When she told me to stay in the room, I noticed her hands were trembling as she looked toward the door. She took a deep breath and stepped out. I stayed in bed, paralyzed by fear, listening to my mother vomiting and my sister crying, trying to pray. My father wasn't home because he had to go to work right after the church event. He had a night job, so it was just my siblings and me at home. The noises eventually subsided, and I must have fallen asleep because I woke up the next day to find my father had returned home. He and my mother were talking in hushed voices, and I caught snippets of their conversation. I heard the words enemy and daughter of God. Later that morning, my father gathered us in the living room to explain what had happened. He told us that while they were praying for the woman at church, my mother felt a powerful presence, and she knew that it wasn't just an ordinary possession. My father said that the enemy or the devil had sent someone or something to attack our family. My mother had felt a stabbing pain in her chest right after they started praying, but she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to draw attention away from the deliverance. But by the time we got home, pain had become unbearable. My father explained that they had spent most of the night praying for her, and that my sister had seen a shadowy figure standing by my mother's bed. They told us to be extra vigilant, to pray every night, and to stay close to God because we never knew when the enemy might try to attack us again. After that night, I developed a fear of the dark that I still struggle with to this day. I always sleep with a light on, and I can't stand to be in complete darkness, not even for a moment. I often wonder if that woman was the reason for what happened to my mother, or if it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, it left a lasting impression on me, and I will never forget the fear I felt that night. The person who recounts this story adamantly insists that he has never once in his life taken drugs, that he is not an alcoholic, and most importantly, that he is not a compulsive liar. To be honest, this needs to be clarified and emphasized because the story he has to tell is as strange as it is terrifying. This anecdote was preserved by his son, who says that his father shared it during one of the last deep conversations they had before the old man died of cancer. He mentioned that his father had never told anyone else, and that when he finally did share it with his son, the old man shed a tear. The reason the son now recapitulates this anecdote is because his father told him he could. It was the early 1970s, late in the morning in a rural area of Arizona. At that time, the young man had about 30 minutes left on his journey. He had just visited his girlfriend, who is now the mother of the man recounting this story, by the way, because he lived far away on his father's farm. You can imagine that on a remote Arizona route in the middle of nowhere and so late at night, not many people passed by. In fact, there was hardly anyone at all, and that was one of the first things he regretted when a very bright light, like a searchlight, completely covered the sky. He actually remembered that the glow was such that he could see the mountains in the dark distance as if it were suddenly daytime. Today we might think it was a meteor, but that was a different era, a different world. The father of this man, then a 25-year-old, briefly theorized that it might be an atomic bomb from Russia, but no, just as the light came, it left. The sky went dark immediately. He turned on the radio, trying to tune into a local station to see if they were talking about it. The man estimates that it was between 3 and 5 minutes later, continuing on his journey, when he suddenly encountered something strange on the road, a crashed car. Although it blocked much of the road, he could maneuver around it, but given the year and the era we are talking about, combined with the good manners of the South, the 25-year-old simply pulled over to the side of the road and got out with the intention of helping whoever had crashed in such a damn inconvenient place at that hour. He had to take only a few steps on the gravel to notice that in front of the crashed car was a man sitting in the street with his back to him. And if he could see him, it was only because of the lights of his own vehicle, because the lights of the crashed car were off. The man did not move or say anything. He was just sitting there. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" But before the young man could get closer, and until his dying days, he never knew why or what blessed and holy reason made him decide to do it, but he stayed planted where he was. He instinctively felt that something was not right. "Sir, are you okay?" "My head hurts a lot," the man declared dryly. "It's killing me. Please help me." The young man would have immediately tended to him if not for the fact that the man did not even turn his head to look him in the face, nor did he attempt to stand up. One might think that the headache prevented him from doing so, but it seemed more like this man was trying to hide something. When the silence dragged on, the man sitting with his back to him threw himself to the ground again. "Please help me." At that moment, the young man began to realize that the man's car was extremely strange. It did not seem real. It was as if it were a makeshift car, something improvised and hastily made. The longer he looked at it, the stranger it became. The best description he could come up with was that it was like the silhouette of a real car, and he insists that the more time he spent observing it, the more details he noticed that it simply was not real, as strange as it sounds. As if the man sitting with his back to him knew that his charade was about to end, he suddenly stood up and turned around. Again, it was the same as with the car, but now much worse, like discovering a nightmare in slow motion, like a horror story from the internet rushing at you down a long hallway. He did not know exactly what it was, but there was something wrong with the man's face, so much so that without fully understanding what it was, terror surged through him like a dark shadow creeping in from the edge of his vision. His sense of survival kicked in, and deep down, instinctively, like something primal, he knew that was not a person. He ran back to his vehicle, and just as he reached to turn the ignition key, he could see out of the corner of his eye how the man was quickly approaching, placing his hands on the sides of the door and leaning in to peer through the window, looking at him up close. It was now unmistakable. He had been right to be suspicious, but the worst part was that the man now looked different, much more disfigured than before. Although disfigured is not the right word, it was something else, something that does not exist in the vocabulary, something so foreign that it is difficult to comprehend. Upon seeing him, he described him, and I quote, as a man without a face. He recalled having locked the car door at some point. He did, and he was thankful for it all his life. That was not human, but it must have known a few things because it repeatedly tried to open the door, and if not for the lock, it would have succeeded. He started the engine and screeching sped away, easily pushing the fake car off the road. He never knew how, in such a state of terror, he managed to drive, but by the time he regained his senses, by the time he had some rational thought, he realized two things. He was already at his father's farm, and he had wet himself out of fear. He told his son that he never understood how he even managed to live composed during those following days, that he changed the hours when he would visit his mother, and that it was an act of heroism, but he never told anyone. Not ever. He never reported it to the police. The only time he opened his mouth to relive that experience was during that conversation with his son. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. Thank you very much. I upload very interesting content every day through my official spaces on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please look me up and follow.